Yes, Trevor, we've been here since early this morning watching the crowds gather. It was very quiet at the beginning of the day here. Most people stayed indoors to watch the funeral on television. But as you can see now, behind me, a very large crowd indeed is building up. And this crowd all the way down the road to Althorpe Park, where the Princess, very privately, is going to be buried. Carrying the Princess's body will pass down this road, we think in about 1 hour's time. Now, I'm joined here in the crowd by somebody who remembers Princess Diana very well, Betty Andrew, housekeeper and a cook at Althorpe Park for many years. Betty, this must have been a difficult afternoon for you.
Well, it has been very emotional. I watched the service this morning and the tears didn't come until the minute silence, and then they did come.
What are your memories of Diana?
Well, I knew her from when she was 14. And she was a very quiet, typical teenager. She was a really lovely girl. I mean, she looked after her brother when he came home from school. She did the ordinary things that a teenager did. I mean, she loved dancing, swimming. She used to come into the kitchen and help me cook when I was cook there.
And to eat as well, I think.
Oh, yes, definitely. They all used to come in. They used to drop the luggage in the front hall. Just raid the larder.
Events have taken obviously an extraordinary turn since those days. I know that you listened to the speech this afternoon of Earl Spencer. What were your reactions to that? Because he had some very strong things to say, didn't he?
Yes, but I think I believed everything he said, because I think that was what he thought, and I think that's what I thought as well. It was a really lovely speech.
Good. Betty, thank you very much. So we're expecting, Trevor, once again the hearse carrying the Princess to pass by here very soon. This road will be closed. Mourners will line this route for the couple of miles to Althorpe. We expect that to happen in about 1 hour's time.
Tim Hewitt in Northamptonshire. Let's look now at an excerpt from this morning's extraordinary procession. Pictures there from the procession this morning featuring two things. One, the princes walking behind their mother's coffin, and then the charities behind. There were so many people from the charities who marched behind the coffin down to Westminster Abbey. Dermot Monaghan can now tell us a little bit about how the service was organised with the help of his two guests. Dermot?
Yes, indeed, Trevor. I'm joined by Colonel Andrew Parsons, an expert in ceremony, and former Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Jim Sewell, who helped police the royal wedding back in 1981. Colonel Parsons, just looking at those scenes there of the young boys lining up behind the coffin of their mother with the Duke of Edinburgh, with Earl Spencer and with Prince Charles. And then the people involved in all the charities milling in behind. There it was. There was the mixture between the ceremonial and the informal.
Wasn't it done beautifully? And the planning beforehand was obviously of key importance. And then Colonel Alexander Matheson, the brigade major at Headquarters Household Division, was the chief marshal, and he had 6 assistants, I think, who steered that informal part of the procession in behind the royal princes to go on down the Mall, and just made sure that that flowed smoothly and kept up to time and so on. And I thought it was done with real tact and skill, very quietly and very effectively, so that the full impact of that quite unique procession came across very well indeed.
Just reflecting for a moment on the very formal part of that ceremony, didn't those young soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the Welsh Guards do very well in that heat, in those uniforms, over that distance? I
thought they were quite outstanding. We have a professional army that we're rightly very proud of, but they produced a near perfect performance throughout, and you're quite right, they had a long march in really very warm weather, and then the most taxing part of the day, taking the coffin up through the Abbey, came with absolutely no respite at all for them. And we saw just from what the weight of the coffin was like, what effort they had to put into it. I think one must also pay tribute to the King's Troop as well. I just noticed at the very beginning of the procession that 1 or 2 of the horses were fidgety, not fractious, but fidgety, and their outstanding horsemanship soon got them to relax, and by the time they came to Buckingham Palace and from then on, they were perfect, as near to perfect as you can be.
Deputy Assistant Commissioner Jim Sewell, you of course helped police the royal wedding in 1981. Very different circumstances, of course, today, but are the numbers similar?
I think there was probably more than at the royal wedding. I understand from colleagues they're saying about 1.5 million people. That may be extended if you think the people we've seen on the television en route to the M1 and Althorpe. So the number could extend from that.
But the police must have had one of the easiest jobs in the world. The rapport with the crowd there. I saw one policeman picking up flowers from someone in the crowd to throw them in front of the hearse. Someone had clearly asked him to do that. Yes,
I had the opportunity to speak with some of the officers, and I agree with what they said, that I have never known such an occasion when there has been so much quiet and reverence, and really the police's job was done for them by the impeccable behaviour of the crowd, which was expected, of course. But what I also thought was really wonderful was the obvious rapport between the police and the public, and you have amply illustrated one of the things that we saw. We also saw as well, when Elton John was singing, some of the officers were greatly affected and actually sobbing and shedding a tear over that as well.
Jim Sewell, Colonel Parsons, thank you very much indeed. Now back to you, Trevor.
Dermot, an indication of some of the planning that went in to Diana's funeral. It's been said again and again that the funeral was the people's funeral, not official and certainly not state. ITN's John Draper has been talking to just a few of the millions who, in their own way, took part today.
First light at Westminster Abbey, and for the thousands who spent the night there, the long wait was coming to an end. Many had endured considerable discomfort to be there to say their final goodbyes to the Princess. But they were glad to be part of a shared experience of people coming together to demonstrate their deep feelings for Diana, Princess of Wales.
I just couldn't miss it. I just thought the world of her, and it's a great loss. She's a great loss to us, and there'll never be a replacement.
Why is it special to be sharing the day with all these other people?
Well, she was special.
Right.
I just wanted to come pay my respects to Diana. She was such a beautiful woman. She cared about lots of other people, including her own children.
But it was only when the cortege made its way through central London, here at Buckingham Palace, taking the People's Princess on her final journey, that the Princess's people began fully to take in their loss.
I didn't realise that I'd feel as bad as I actually did when it went past. Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't help but cry when she came back.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so simple. The casket, the flowers on the casket, very appropriate for her.
This was a royal funeral, but the people's wishes were respected. The Union flag flew for the first time ever at Buckingham Palace. As it was lowered to half-mast, the people showed their appreciation. Tens of thousands watched the funeral and the service on massive screens in Hyde Park. Elton John reflected their feelings.
And it seems to me you lived your life like a candle in the wind, never fading with the sunset when the rain set in. And your footsteps will always fall here along England's greenest hill. Your candles burned out long before your legend ever will.
At the Abbey, the service was also relayed, the Earl Spencer's tribute striking a chord with those outside.
We want you to know that life without you is very, very difficult.
As inside the Abbey, they broke into spontaneous applause. At Harrods, a few miles away, the minute's silence which ended the service had particular poignancy. As the mourners left Westminster Abbey, one of the Princess's advisors summed up the thoughts of many.
If only things had been different, what a queen we would have had.
She didn't become queen, but she'll always be the people's princess. John Draper, ITN.
One of the charities for which the Princess works so tirelessly was the British Red Cross. One of the officials of that charity is talking now to Julia Somerville. Julia?
Yes, indeed. I have with me Dr. Frank Riding of the British Red Cross. Dr. Riding, you were here as a representative of the charities who played such an important part in today's service. Did the service as a whole live up to your expectations?
Oh yes, I think so. I mean, I'm a fairly hard-bitten individual and nothing gets through to me, but this did. It was really very emotional. I think the thing that surprised me actually was the fact that we were all there together. I mean, I was literally a few seats away from the royal family. Tony Blair was facing me, and I always thought we'd be probably put somewhere at the back, but we weren't. We were members of almost one big family, really, and that surprised me and delighted me. I think that was very appropriate.
It was appropriate, and it was, I'm sure, in keeping with what are perceived as the Princess's wishes, that her charity work in particular should be one of the things that she's remembered for. Now, you were very connected to her campaign against landmines. Did you find that she was as involved and as well informed as other people have found with their charity work?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I've worked with Red Cross surgical hospitals for a long time, and I think that what she achieved in a very short time of her support for landmine victims did far more than I could ever have hoped to achieve in 18 years of work, and for that I'm very humbled and in fact very grateful. And I think that even after her death today, I think her influence is actually living on. That's not dead at all. That's going to continue. And I think I'll always be grateful for that.
Do you feel, after having been through the service today, a sense of catharsis? Or do you think the general feeling that's left, particularly after Lord Spencer's speech, is one of a rather troubled atmosphere?
I thought it was very impressive, and I think everyone else felt that. The ripple of applause, which I gathered started outside the cathedral, we could hear it coming through the nave slowly, and all the people in the actual abbey itself taking part of the service took up this applause, and it's sort of the atmosphere from outside was actually shared inside, which I thought was very strange, but again very moving.
I think the silence was also one of the qualities, particularly at the beginning and the end of the service, and certainly outside here, although there were thousands and thousands of people, everybody was absolutely rapt with attention, listening to what we could hear on the speakers. Inside the church, it must have been even more impressive.
Oh, it was absolutely. The atmosphere was very quiet and very dignified, which I think was something that was deserved by it. And at the same time, this achievement of mixing the modern and the traditional, which I think was one of the aims of the people who organised it, I think that came off incredibly well. I certainly felt it, and certainly the Red Cross people I was with felt that as well.
And of course, it was a perfect summary of a princess such as Diana, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was, and very eerie things took place, like when the two sisters were doing the readings, and I felt a lot of people felt this as well. They looked in a way a bit like Diana, and their voices sounded a little bit Diana. That was very strange and a little bit disturbing in a way, and yet moving, because you could almost feel that it was Princess Diana herself who was actually saying these words. And that was another effect which I felt very moving. The whole thing, I thought, was done very well, and it was just what was needed at this time.
Dr. Frank Riding, thank you very much indeed for that. Back to you now, Trevor.
Thanks, Julia. You're watching a specially extended coverage of the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales. As you know, we're waiting for the hearse carrying the princess's body to arrive at Althorpe Park for the private family burial. We think that that should happen about 3 o'clock or at about 3:15. And then later this afternoon, we'll rebroadcast this morning's procession and the service at Westminster Abbey. We'll show you that at around 3:30 for anyone who's just coming in. In the meantime, my guest, Hugo Vickers, rejoins us. Robert Lacey's here. Hugo Vickers, was there any discussion at all about that very moving, silent journey of the coffin from Kensington Palace down to the Abbey? People threw flowers, but at the beginning, there was a marvellous, solemn silence about it.
Yes, I think that's one of the many spontaneous things that's happened in the course of the last week. And I think that they were obviously very anxious that it shouldn't be in any sense a really a military procession with the normal bands and sort of drums and things like that. So I think that already in a way inspired a certain silence. I mean, again, of course, we did notice a little sort of bit of, in a sense, some wailing almost at the beginning, and I thought that might take over. But I think in a way this kind of very silent this solemn clapping, which is evidently a French thing, was also rather moving. I think that worked very well.
You said that, of course, I mean, it was silent and it was solemn, and that was probably very much Diana, Princess of Wales. But then the contrast came with the fact that the cortege went through these rather pompous arcades and redolent of history and power and privilege and sort of institutionalized.
That's right. He went past the Albert Memorial and the Wellington's Memorial and his house. And she was going into history, wasn't she? And we're all part of history. And her own particular characteristics will be lent to that. The thing I particularly liked was the way in which the coffin, as it went through the doors of the Abbey, the clock struck 11. And I'd wondered, why are we starting at 8 minutes past 9?
Precision.
Marvellous British precision, which is just what the Queen had asked for the night before.
She would have been very pleased about the number of people from the variety of various interests who turned up there. It was a panorama of her life in one respect.
It certainly was, and you know, all through this week we've been amazed, I think, by the amount of flowers, but were we not also astonished when we first saw Hyde Park? We've talked about a carpet of flowers. I mean, the whole of Hyde Park was covered. I mean, that was just completely astounding. Everybody wanted to be there together to watch those screens, those that couldn't see the procession, and to take part of it. It's got a tremendous spirit of unity, really.
Because
well, just one other thing. I just wanted to say the memory of those boys walking with their father. I thought that was a few good points for the stiff upper lip and British stoicism that's been rather rubbished perhaps in the past week, but I think it's what actually everybody expected, and everybody feels the better for having seen.
Robert Lacey, Hugh Vickers, for the moment, thank you very much. We've been talking about individual moments about what we saw this morning, but for a brief roundup of the highlights of the morning, here's Hugh Pym.
All night they'd waited, and as the coffin at last left Kensington Palace, the grief of some in the crowd was plain. The coffin borne on the gun carriage of the Royal Horse Artillery, the bearer party from the Welsh Guards, thousands packing every inch of this extended route. But apart from the sound of the horses' hooves, the procession was watched in almost total silence. At Westminster Abbey, those invited to the funeral were arriving from the world of entertainment: Tom Cruise, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg. From the world of politics, Lady Thatcher among former Prime Ministers, and Hillary Clinton. And then Mohammed Al Fayed, grieving both for Diana and his eldest son. As the cortege neared Buckingham Palace, the Queen, Princess Margaret and other members of the royal family waited and watched. And then the most poignant of moments, the two young princes would be joining the procession for its final stage. Prince William and Prince Harry, their father alongside, with Earl Spencer and the Duke of Edinburgh. More than 500 representatives of Diana's charities processing slowly behind them. And as they moved through from Horse Guards Parade to Whitehall, there was a touch of reassurance for Prince Harry from his uncle. And at last they reached the Abbey, exactly as planned, a few minutes before 11, for this essentially private service, which was to be at the same time a uniquely public occasion. No fanfares, no trumpets and drums, but a mix of traditional and popular, chosen to reflect the character and spirit of Diana.
Goodbye, England's rose. May you ever grow in our hearts. You were the grace that placed ourselves where lives were torn apart. Goodbye, English road, from a country lost without your soul, who missed the wings of your compassion more than you'll ever know.
And so to the tribute to Diana, Princess of Wales, by the Earl Spencer, with strong words for the media, who he said had hounded his sister.
Of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age.
And the young princes, Prince Charles and members of the Spencer family arriving there, they arrived by royal train at Long Buckby. And from there, from the cars which are positioned there, we imagine that they will have a short drive to the Spencer family estate at Northamptonshire. Just got those pictures in. Long Buckby is the station. Live these pictures are. The princes and the Spencers, Prince Charles included, just arrived, a fleet of cars there to take them all to the Spencer estate, where everything will be private. It's a very short journey from London. Of course, while they're there, the hearse is still making its way, so there'll be some time before the hearse arrives at the Spencer estate. But no doubt the princes, Prince Charles, members of the Spencer family will be getting into those cars very shortly and moving off and heading up for the estate. Not very short, not very long a journey from there. So Robert Lacey, the princes reuniting with the cortege now in Northamptonshire. Yes. This is going to be the final private aspect of today's very public event.
Yes, yes, going home, reclaimed, once again returning to Lord Spencer's speech. Everybody seems to be dwelling on the contentious things he said, but it was really very, I thought, a human speech, talking about.
He'd be very satisfied with his performance today.
Yes, and I felt satisfied listening to it. I felt finally everything had been said. The anger had been expressed, but the family feelings had been expressed as well. The human emotions had been worked through.
Hugo Vickers, your views?
Yes, I mean, there's absolutely no question about it that Lord Spencer was speaking the truth.
There are people, as you can see, people applauding again. It seems to become rather the custom from this morning. My colleague John Suchet said earlier that it's a French custom, but there they were doing it too in Northamptonshire.
Yes, they've picked that up, and it is must be very emotional for the people of Northamptonshire as they reclaim.
Are the Spencers very close to the people there?
Well, they've been there for a very long time, and they have taken a big part in Northamptonshire life, and particularly
we're off those pictures now, and we interrupted the speech by the Earl Spencer to bring you those pictures, which we're just getting in. Let's return now to what he actually said this morning.
Of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the the most hunted person of the modern age. She would want us today to pledge ourselves to protecting her beloved boys, William and Harry, from a similar fate. And I do this here, Diana, on your behalf. Above all, we give thanks for the life of a woman I'm so proud to be able to call my sister. The unique, the complex, the extraordinary and irreplaceable Diana, whose beauty, both internal and external, will never be extinguished from our minds.
In another extraordinary break with tradition, applause slowly swelled around Westminster Abbey. Finally, the minute's silence. The hearse then left the Abbey to begin its journey to Northamptonshire. Applause among the thousands lining the Mall. Many throwing flowers as their final tribute to Diana. Cue him, ITN.
We've just heard that the police estimate there were 1 million people in London this morning following the proceedings at Westminster Abbey. 1 million people coming out in tribute to Diana, Princess of Wales. Joe Andrews is in Hyde Park. Joe, give us a sense of what was going on there this morning as the service was being conducted at Westminster.
There were literally thousands of people here. Most of them were listening in silence, and I guess that here too the applause started for Earl Spencer's speech long before it became heard inside Westminster Abbey. But the numbers of people I've spoken to here who say yes, the Earl Spencer's speech will remain with them. But I think what will also remain with people here is the sight, the silent sight of that coffin coming up Carriage Drive. Most people here were able to see it for 10 to 15 minutes in complete silence. All I heard then were people beginning to cry, and it was a truly extraordinary thing.
You were right close up to the route. It must have been very moving.
It was very moving. People were very tired by that stage. A lot of them had been here all night. I was here until about midnight last night. Spoke to some of the people. They did have some rain during the night, but they were completely determined that they would stay here until they saw the coffin. One of them said to me that he wouldn't believe that she was dead until he had seen with his own eyes the cortege come past him.
Mike Burnson talked earlier, he was talking from the cenotaph, about the friendliness which seemed to have evolved over these many hours and days among the people. Did you see evidence of that there?
Certainly, yes. Children were pushed to the front very gently. I was at St James's earlier this week and I was completely struck by that. Marlborough Road became impassable at times, and yet no one complained, no one tried to push through other people. They made way for the younger, they made way for the older. Nobody said anything grumpy to each other. They were just extraordinarily gentle, and there was a great dignity in that, as there was here today.
And of course the other thing we mentioned, and we've kept mentioning throughout the days now, ever since the tragedy of Diana's death, no need for any kind of crowd control. All these people who were signing books of condolences, all these people queuing for hours outside the royal palaces to place their floral tributes, no need for control. The policemen were there, the policewomen were there, but just standing back, helping the crowd to express what they wanted to.
Yes, the policeman who was standing beside us said that he had been at Winston Churchill's funeral, and he had been down, I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning. He said he'd gone down to the Thames and he'd nearly frozen to death, and he stood beside us and talked about it. And a lot of the children who were here, for whom this was the most important day of their lives, were able to listen to him talking about what for him up until today had been a very big day.
Joe, the other thing we picked up was that they themselves, the policemen, were very strangely moved. Not that they're incapable of expressing these human emotions, but we don't always see them in that light.
No,
we see them doing a very tough job. But I looked at some of the pictures this morning, and they themselves were very moved, weren't they?
There was a very large bearded inspector who was standing in the middle of the road, and at one stage he got out his handkerchief, wiped both of his eyes, took his hat off and blew his nose and then put it back on again. And it was just the same for the police. They were standing round the cameras afterwards saying that that was quite extraordinary, that they had never seen anything like it, and that they were moved just like ordinary people.
And is anything of normal life returning now to Hyde Park there?
Yes, as you can see behind me, the flowers are still being laid down. People are still coming to read the messages. Interestingly, on these flowers, some of the messages are not for Diana, but in fact for the two princes, commending their performance today, telling them how much people here love them. There are other people who, as I say, have been here all night who are taking the chance to catch up on some sleep. So they've got the sleeping bags back out in the pillows and they've just fallen asleep in the sunshine here. They've seen what they came to see. Perhaps now they'll begin to believe it.
Joe, thank you very much. Let's go to join Adrian Britton now in Knightsbridge. Adrian?
Yes, Trevor, it was interesting to hear you say a few minutes ago about the police estimate on the number of people who came to London. Because though people have come from all over the country, there are many people who came here today from overseas. Some indeed perhaps were tourists who came last week and then suddenly found themselves caught up in the tragic events of the week. With me is a gentleman from Canada. I mean, from an overseas perspective, what did you think of the service?
I thought it was very touching, and it was special to be in Hyde Park to participate in it.
What did you think of Earl Spencer's speech? Many people have said today that it was very, very forceful.
I thought so. It's difficult living overseas to really understand how the situation was here, but for me, perhaps some of it would be better suited at another time.
You think it was inappropriate?
Yes, I do, yes.
Two ladies here from the United States. From an overseas perspective, anything in particular which you found particularly moving?
I felt that the calm was moving. The many people in one place was probably the most special.
When you were there, when you were watching the service on those large screens at Hyde Park, very, very quickly, what was the feeling like? Any particular emotion that came to mind when Elton John was singing his song?
When Elton, sadness. It was extremely sad. It was a beautiful song, though. I loved it. The words were perfect. I think he did a wonderful job.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to me. With that, back to you, Trevor.
Adrian Britton in Knightsbridge. And now someone who has had a very close, a very important role in the life of Diana, Princess of Wales. Lord Richard Attenborough, we understand, actually gave her coaching lessons about speaking. He's talking now to Julia Somerville. Julia?
Yes, indeed. Well, Lord Attenborough, you are known, I hope you won't mind me saying, as a man who shows your emotions. I think today was a day when everybody involved, whether they were outside the church watching on television or inside the church, could not help but show their emotions. It was that sort of occasion, wasn't it?
It was. It was unique. It was extraordinary. I thought the service as such was so wonderfully adjudged. The two sisters' readings, Earl Spencer's address, which was courageous and outspoken and critical in some degree. I felt Elton sang as only Elton can, and Cum Ronda, and the Prime Minister's reading of Faith, Hope and Charity. I mean, I thought that was just wonderful, marvellous.
And as someone who knew the Princess for a very long time and, if you like, helped bring her forward, made her into the swan that she became, did you feel that that poignancy about her came through? I'm very sorry, they want us to go back now. Back to you, Trevor.
And I'm sorry we had to interrupt Julia Somerville there and Lord Attenborough, but we have some pictures which suggest that the cortege is now arriving, or the royal family, I'm sorry, arriving at Althorpe. Procession of cars. I'm joined by our royal correspondent, Nicholas Owen, who's joined us in the studio. Nick, here are the pictures just coming in.
Getting more formal again in a way, Trevor, isn't it? A cavalcade of those large motor cars.
Yes.
Associates with royalty and top people generally, compared with a sort of informality, really, one might almost say.
But still a sprinkling of people on the sidelines, and look at the bouquets outside the Spencer estate, the entrance to the Spencer estate.
As the royal family, the princes, sweep in through the gates for what we know is to be a private, strictly private burial service, Earl Spencer has made it clear that they do not wish the world's cameras to see the final interment of the Princess of Wales, and I think there is nobody at all who would begrudge him that wish.
I think those are the last images. That convoy now goes, and let's go back now to Julia Somerville with apologies for interrupting the noble Lord Attenborough.
Thank you indeed. Well, the noble Lord Attenborough very graciously agreed to stay on. I was just really raising with you the fact that you had known Diana as, you know, a young girl really, which is what she was when she came on the scene. You gave her help in a number of ways, and at the end you must have felt you had helped produce a real swan.
Oh, I couldn't possibly take that credit. No. My assistance was really about speaking and microphones and so on. The one thing that I do take pride in happened quite latterly, which of course was the landmines campaign, which I helped to persuade her to take on board, as it were, not merely to deal with it, as she did with quite a number of other charities, quite privately, that this really did need to be said, and said loudly. A certain amount of the establishment were very cruel to her and condemned her for, they said, moving out of the area where the establishment and the royal family ought to be. But I disagree profoundly. In fact, I believe there's the possibility that the Landmines Conference in Oslo, the treaty, if it's signed, may be called the Princess Diana Treaty. And that she did. There's no question whatsoever. Around the world, she made that possible. You made a remark earlier, which I thought was marvellous, Julia. If one wanted to say anything about her, what she wanted to do, particularly for her sons, was to make them aware of the outside world, not live in that ring-fenced atmosphere of establishment where nothing, it's red carpets and public arrivals and procedures and so on. She wanted them to know about the cruelty and the hardship and the deprivation and the unfashionable things. And you said just now how wonderful it was that when Earl Spencer finished his address, it was from outside that the approval came. And sitting in the Abbey and hearing that applause begin outside and then move all the way down the nave until the whole congregation were applauding with such affection and respect and awareness of what she's contributed. I thought it was an extraordinary and unique occasion.
Talking about that side of Diana and her desire to make sure that the princes grew up with her values, what did you make of Lord Spencer making this very clear declaration that he and the Spencer family were going to take those princes over in that respect? They were going to make sure that they fulfilled that function in their lives.
She believed in that passionately, and I think it would have been heartbreaking if Earl Spencer had not been as outspoken as he was. The family adored her, as millions and millions of other people did. And I think that what she stood for and the contribution that she's made, I mean, it was very revealing, wasn't it? You know this more than I, because you do all this sort of commentary on national events and so on. The fact that the Queen did not record her speech, and the fact that she spoke live and said, we must not forget what Princess Diana did and stood for, we shall remember, etc. Now that happened, I think, in large measure because of the scale of the public determination to recognize what she did. And I think Earl Spencer is a very determined man, and if he calls on people like me very humbly to do whatever we can, we will do anything he asks.
Lord Attenborough, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for your patience in sticking with us. Back to you now, Trevor.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Lord Attenborough. Nicholas Owen, our royal correspondent, as I said, has joined me now. He's sitting alongside Hugo Vickers. Nick, what are your impressions, overall impressions of the day?
I suppose it's much as it's been all this week, really, Trevor, that nothing was predictable. Everything was surprising. We knew Elton John was going to sing, but we didn't really know whether that was going to go well. It could have been a little embarrassing, frankly, but it wasn't. It was fantastic. We didn't know quite who would walk behind the coffin, and there was the Duke of Edinburgh, the grandfather of William and Harry, determined to show, obviously extremely from the heart, that family were absolutely united in supporting those two boys. I didn't expect to hear applause on the London streets like that in the way that we heard it. I didn't expect to see flowers hurled at the hearses that went by. I didn't expect all sorts of things about the day. That's really the point. So many set pieces we were ready for, so much about it we couldn't possibly have been ready for, and we all share across the whole country, across the whole world, in this sort of spontaneous reaction to things.
When it actually happened, I heard you exclaim almost about the members of the royal family, senior members of the royal family, coming and standing outside Buckingham Palace. We usually see them on the balcony. They had come down to the people's level, almost to Diana's level at that moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There they stood, just a sort of family group. The Duchess of York, you notice, was in that group. And
yes.
Of course, you know, she is divorced from the Duke of York, and so emphasising really that at times of grief, at times of when death strikes, families do thankfully come together. And there was that family together on parade in public grieving.
Hugo, we understood that most of them spent the night last night at Buckingham Palace, which reinforces the point that Nicholas Owen is making, that at times of national crisis, this family has the capacity to bind together perhaps as no one else.
Yes, it does. I think that the criticism of the family earlier in the week was very unkind, because I'm sure that the point's been made now that what the Queen was trying to do was to give strength to her two grandchildren so that they could face today's ordeal, and it would seem, would it not, that that was entirely successful, that they had the strength in those few tranquil days all together quietly at Balmoral to come down and to perform so splendidly in public as they did.
You say unjustified, but do you think some of all the scenes we saw today, including the one I just mentioned about the family coming down, would have happened had there not been some element of disquiet? Do you think that would have occurred?
No, I don't think it would have occurred. I think you're quite right. I think the element of disquiet did this, but I think also that the Palace and the Queen have responded tremendously quickly all throughout the week. If you wind the clock back to last weekend, it's very hard to put things into perspective now.
Sure.
The Princess was so much a member of the Spencer family. I mean, we almost forget that they were divorced. The royal family would have been very, very sensitive to the idea that they would not wish in any way to exploit this or to move too fast, too forward in a situation which had other family elements in it. And I think they waited, and I think the disquiet was expressed quite fiercely, but then it was responded to, and I hope that at the end of the day the response was seen to be, you know, we said we want the Queen to come, and the Queen came. And I hope that it will be seen that. And she did some more spontaneous things, incidentally, today. You notice perhaps that she stepped forward in the Abbey and placed a wreath in front of the coffin herself. She didn't do that for Lord Mountbatten.
No,
in those days,
right.
The formalities were observed.
That's right. Well, perhaps this breaking of protocol, this breaking of the formal way of doing things might be a lasting influence.
Well, it might.
Just perhaps.
It might be a lasting influence, but I think I'd go back to what was said again. This is a unique funeral for a unique person.
Hugo Vickers, Nicholas Owen, for the time being, thank you very much. Of course, hundreds of thousands of people have travelled to London today from around the country. But in cities, towns and villages throughout Britain, people held their own services to mark the Princess's funeral. And of course, people across the land stopped whatever they were doing when the service ended to observe the 1-minute silence. ITN's Robert Hall looks now at how a nation remembered.
United in grief. In every square, in every street, the nation paid its respects and said its farewells. Shops and businesses shuttered. The country's transport arteries deserted. Heathrow Airport, rarely still, had halted all flights to mark the Princess's passing. A lament at a crossroads of the world. And in Belfast, a city with so many tragic stories, daily life was frozen as they shared another family's loss. On the platforms at Sheffield, journeys set aside, thoughts far away. Far to the west, the toll booths on Plymouth's Tamar Bridge closed to what little traffic remained. Those who could had gathered at their parish churches. Many hundreds watched this last journey amongst a worldwide television audience. This was perhaps the simplest tribute of all. For a few brief moments, distance didn't matter. The whole country stood there with the mourners at Westminster. They stopped, they bowed their heads, they remembered. In Cardiff Cathedral, Welsh voices raised for their princess. The silence broken, the moment passed. But this had been a day when every person in every corner of Britain could make their promise never to forget.
And I'm told now we have some helicopter shots of the hearse making its way to the Spencer estate. My colleague John Suchet is looking at them.
Well, those in a moment, but first these shots from London, from our helicopter over Kensington Palace in Hyde Park. The sea of white in the middle, it looks like a lake, doesn't it? It's actually all the bouquets that have been laid along the gates that form the entrance to Kensington Palace. They make the form of a cross down the broad avenue and the path across the top. And there are hundreds of thousands of bouquets there, all with personal messages. One wonders what will happen to them. One hopes that the messages will perhaps be scooped up and given to Princes William and Harry to keep forever. The crowd's still there in huge numbers, looking at the flowers, no doubt adding to them. And this was the Princess's London home, as we know. It's where her coffin lay overnight, and from where it began its journey this morning to Westminster Abbey. A sight there that has never been seen before, and which surely sums up the day and the love that so many people felt for Princess Diana.
John Suchet. Michael Brunson now joins me at Horse Guards Arch in Whitehall. Michael, the crowd seem to have dispersed there now.
Yes, the crowds have dispersed, and in any moment now you may have visible signs very much of life returning to normal, because the road is now being opened. And another sense, in a way, of life going on. We have the mounted guard on guard there. They have been on guard all the time, but we haven't been able to see them because of the crowds. And so very much life continues. It was a very, very emotional morning here as we all stood and took part in the service, those of us in the open air joining in with those in the Abbey. I can tell you my eyes were pretty moist during all that. But now life is picking up. Yes, you can just see the traffic behind me. And I think in a way that's a symbol of something that I think will be the legacy of Princess Diana now, because in three particular ways she is going to have an influence on the political and constitutional life of this country, in my view. As Lord Attenborough was saying earlier on, the landmines campaign, that will go on. She will always be remembered for that. But tomorrow Mr. Blair goes to see the Queen for lunch and so on at Balmoral. Absolutely no question that privately one of the things on the agenda will be whither the monarchy now. How does the monarchy proceed from now? Not that Mr. Blair will force any particular ideas, but it is bound to be discussed. And I'm sure the royal family will have taken great strength from all that has happened today. And thirdly, as a result of Earl Spencer's very fierce words in the Abbey, the whole question of the conduct of the press. Of course, there will be those people who would tell you that it wasn't just the press who were criticising Princess Diana. You remember the criticisms that came from within the last government, and indeed some MPs recently, one of them saying, "Oh, here we go again," when she was making some critical remarks. But certainly I think that will be on the agenda. So as we speak to you here, life coming back to normal, Diana's legacy living on in all kinds of ways.
Michael, can I just pick up the point? Because we were talking all through last week, when there were these first calls, after the first denunciations about the paparazzi, we were talking about the possibility not only of bringing in new laws about freedom of the press, about privacy and so on, but about using those laws which exist now to try to stop this kind of harassment. In view of what, as you said, Earl Spencer said today, do you think that is likely to give any further momentum? He was pretty forthright about it.
Oh, he was very, very forthright. I was very surprised indeed, but there is no strength whatsoever of the strength of feeling by the Earl. As you know, he immediately denounced the press the moment the news came through. Then he requested that 6 or 7 editors of tabloid newspapers should not attend the funeral. And today he used, very unusually, the tribute in the Abbey to make this point. In answer to your specific question, I'm certain that it still remains the government's view not to rush into any new laws. It's a very difficult area to legislate in. But yes, it is still my view that when this is looked at by the government, they will look at the existing laws that have come in, for example, defining harassment in the case of stalking, and they will look to see whether there are things that should be done to protect public figures. And you can be absolutely certain of the government's determination, as well as the palace's determination, to protect those young princes. They will be protected, that is quite certain. But I don't think at this stage anyone would want to do anything at all which would harm them, because now, I suspect, is the time when the real grieving for those boys begins. They've got through, I thought, absolutely magnificently what they had to do today, but it'll now sink in, won't it?
Michael Bernsen at Horse Guards Arch. And while we're waiting for the hearse to make its way, here are some hymns and songs from the service this morning.
Goodbye, England's rose. May you ever grow in our hearts. You were the grace that placed ourselves where lives were torn apart. Goodbye, English road, from a country lost without your soul, who missed the wings of your compassion more than you will ever know. And it seems to me you've lived your life like a candle in the wind, never fading with the sunset when the rain set in. And your footsteps will always fall here along England's greenest hills. Your candles burned out long before your legend ever will.
Let's go now to my colleague John Suchet, who has some news about the progress of the hearse towards Northamptonshire. John?
Yes, still on the M1, the northern section of this journey. You can see the traffic, the ordinary traffic behind it, travelling very slowly. And perhaps ordinary traffic going in the other direction. It's impossible to say. But when it reaches the junction on the M1, it will turn off to travel northeast from the M1 towards Althorpe for the final private funeral this afternoon. Again, unprecedented scenes. Look, people standing by the side of a motorway and no police trying to clear them. There's no danger, they just want to watch the Princess pass. Slow, stately, perfect formation. The Princess of Wales on her final journey. Moment for me to tell you that around the world 2.5 billion people have been watching today's funeral, and radio and television programs the world over, as the crowd surges to the other side of the bridge, have broadcast the Princess's funeral in around 50 languages.
Nick, the hearse making its final journey, the final stages of its journey. Robert Lacey, who was sitting in that seat before you came in, was making the point that in burying the Princess on that island, the Spencer family are almost reclaiming her, to their memory at least.
Yes, I suppose there's a bit of reclaiming going on both families, really, isn't there? I mean, divorce is always a wretched business for everybody involved, but here is a time for sort of healing wounds. The royal family bringing her back, if you like, that was made very clear by the Queen's broadcast last night, I think, when the hurt that she had said through her spokesman that she'd felt at the way people doubted her grief, she paraded that publicly on air for all of us. And I think I agree with that a bit, though, that the Spencers too have had their say in the end. The end of the story is to be burial in that lovely, lovely place that we've heard about, that lake in the middle, that island in the middle of an ornamental lake. I think that's right as well. So in the end, all these sort of wretched divisions within the family and families and wrangles over all sorts of things, all sorted out eventually in death.
But Hugo Vickers made the point earlier that, of course, the Queen today was outstanding in her perception of precisely what needed to be done. I thought the gesture of laying a wreath in the Abbey itself was, as Hugo said earlier, quite unprecedented and really very, very significant.
It's almost as if an official in the royal household has been told, go and have a look at all the protocol and let's see what we can junk. Because frankly, practically everything was. They just sort of ticked them, oh, we don't need to do that. Why do we do that? No, we don't need to do that. And why can't Her Majesty do this? Lay a wreath. Oh, she doesn't do that. She didn't do it at Earl Mountbatten's funeral, as you were saying earlier. Let's do it this time. That was the mood. It was the sort of thing the Princess of Wales was brilliant at doing. The unexpected and the thing that no one thought was possible. She did it. Now we see on this day the Queen and everybody doing it.
Nick Owen, for the time being, thank you very much. While we're waiting for the hearse to arrive at Althorpe, let's find out a little more about Diana's final resting place. Her brother Lord Spencer said this week it won't be beside her beloved father in the family burial plot in the village churchyard, as we were just saying. Instead, she'll be laid to rest in a tree-covered island in a lake in the grounds of Althorpe Park, as ITN's Richard Lindley now reports.
It's like something from a medieval romance. An island surrounded by a beautiful ornamental lake, Diana's last resting place is a magical spot, fit for a legendary princess. This is a part of the Spencer family estate that she particularly loved. Some of the trees around it have been planted by Diana herself, as well as by her two sons, William and Harry. Inside the walls surrounding Althorpe House, they will be able to visit their mother's grave in privacy. All this week, the Spencer family flag has flown at half-mast in mourning for Diana. It's time for the harvest now in this classic English countryside where the Spencers have lived for nearly 500 years, next to the village of Great Brington. 20 generations of Diana's ancestors lie buried in the parish church of St Mary, but no family vault can contain such a dazzling figure as Diana. She went away from this small English village to shine like a star in the greater world beyond. Now the light that illuminated so many people's lives has gone out. But as a handwritten note here in the church puts it, Diana, your light will shine forever in our hearts. All week, people have come to pay their tribute to Diana and lay their flowers at the gates of Althorpe House. Now those flowers have been carefully rearranged to leave the entrance clear for Diana to come home. It seems inevitable that Althorpe House will now become a centre of pilgrimage for people from all round the world who feel that Diana has somehow touched their lives and helped them. The Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, has promised that for a number of weeks every year he will open the park to visitors who want to see where she is buried. And soon now Diana will be here. Soon the princess who led such a hectic, brief and brilliant life will be resting peacefully in this lovely place. It is a unique setting, entirely fit for a princess unlike any other we have known. Richard Lindley, ITN.
Throughout the day here in the studio and with our correspondents around the country and around the capital, we've been talking about various aspects of what happened this morning. But of course the focal point of the day was that service at Westminster Abbey and the celebration of Diana's life. Let's remind ourselves of some of the very moving readings at that service this morning.
If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others, sore undone, who keep long vigils by the silent dust, and weep. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than thine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I, perchance, may therein comfort you.
Time is too slow for those who wait, too swift for those who fear, too long for those who grieve, too short for those who rejoice. But for those who love, time is eternity.
When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now, we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love.
We will all feel cheated, always, that you were taken from us so young, and yet we must learn to be grateful that you came along at all. Only now you are gone do we truly appreciate what we are now without, and we want you to know that life without you is very, very difficult. We have all despaired at our loss over the past week, and only the strength of the message you gave us through your years of giving has afforded us the strength to move forward. There is a temptation to rush to canonize your memory. There is no need to do so. You stand tall enough as a human being of unique qualities, not to need to be seen as a saint. Indeed, to sanctify your memory would be to miss out on the very core of your being, your wonderfully mischievous sense of humor with a laugh that bent you double, your joy for life transmitted wherever you took your smile and the sparkle in those unforgettable eyes, your boundless energy which you could barely contain. But your greatest gift was your intuition, and it was a gift you used wisely. This is what underpinned all your other wonderful attributes. And if we look to analyze what it was about you that had such a wide appeal, we find it in your instinctive feel for what was really important in all our lives. Without your God-given sensitivity, we would be immersed in greater ignorance at the anguish of AIDS and HIV sufferers, the plight of the homeless, the isolation of lepers, the random destruction of landmines.
Earl Spencer this morning speaking very movingly about Diana, Princess of Wales. Now we are told that in a few minutes we might see pictures of Her Majesty the Queen going back to Balmoral from RAF Northolt. If we get those pictures, you'll see them. In the meantime, Hugo Vickers and Nicholas Owen are with me again. Michael Brunson mentioned in connection with the Queen going back to Balmoral that there might be discussions about what's gone on here this week when Tony Blair goes up there. Hugo Vickers, do you buy that?
Yes, well, as I understand it, Tony Blair would have been spending the weekend with the Queen. The Prime Minister always goes up for a night at about this time of the year, and so he's going to go up there tomorrow. I'm sure they will discuss a lot about what's happened.
How are these, you're a royal expert, how are these discussions carried on, though? Because I'm sure the Prime Minister won't want to initiate a discussion about the sort of shape of the royal family. How will it emerge?
Well, the wonderful thing about when the Prime Minister and the Queen do have a discussion is that they are sitting opposite each other in comfortable armchairs, and they are free to talk about anything they like, with a sure knowledge on both sides that it will not be repeated. That's the great joy of it, and that is, of course, the great value of having a constitutional monarch who has been reigning for 45 years, who incidentally dealt with the first Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, a man born in 1874, and is now dealing with a Prime Minister who wasn't even born when she came on the throne. So I think it could be an interesting discussion on both sides.
Nicholas Owen, the subjects for discussion, I mean, one of the subjects for discussion, of course, we heard in the last few days that these calls between the Prime Minister and Prince Charles were probably responsible for the shape and the form of what we saw today. And that might give a clue as to how these discussions might flow, do you think?
Well, I suppose there might be a bit of that. I suppose the Queen might say to the Prime Minister in some shape or form, you've been talking to His Royal Highness, she might say, my son, and I think she will acknowledge, she'll have to acknowledge that a younger generation is thinking about these things very clearly, and she's an extreme realist, the Queen, absolute realist. She's had many, many years to get used to the idea of things changing. You know, it's often said nothing changes at Buckingham Palace. It isn't so. It usually changes a little bit more slowly than in the course of one tumultuous week, I have to say. And I'm sure people will be sitting there at Balmoral and saying, well, let's just not be too hasty about this, but certainly let us, this new thinking, percolate around. Let the advisors get together. Let's draw up some papers. Let's think sensibly about the next steps.
Nicholas, Hugo, thank you very much indeed for the time being. Let's go now to Mark Webster in Hyde Park.
Yes, indeed, Trevor. As you can probably see,